Today, we're going to talk about a moment that completely changed the game for modern India, the economic reforms of 1991. Now, this isn't just some dry economic story. It's a high-stakes drama about a country on the absolute verge of going bankrupt and how it was forced to make some radical choices that would reshape its future. So how on earth did they pull it off? Let's get into it.
So this is the big question, right? You've got a country of more than 800 million people, and it's literally days away from not being able to pay its bills. I mean, how do you even start to fix a problem that enormous? Well, the answer starts with a crisis that was so bad it forced a revolution.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at just how bad the crisis was. Then, we'll dig into the bold new policy that was created to fix it. We'll explore the three main parts of that plan. And finally, we'll step back and see what the impact has been. You know, the good and the not so good 3 decades later.
Okay, let's set the scene. It's 1991, and India is staring down the barrel of an economic emergency like it's never seen before. And this wasn't just a small downturn. It was a total, perfect storm threatening to sink the entire ship.
Just think about this for a second. India's foreign exchange reserves, that's the hard currency, like US dollars, that it needs to buy essential stuff like oil, had practically vanished. The country had enough money to pay for less than 2 weeks of imports. After that, the lights could literally go out. It was that serious.
So how did it get this bad? Well, it wasn't an overnight thing. For years, the government was spending way more money than it was bringing in. A lot of that spending was on important things like social programs and defense, but that stuff doesn't create revenue right away. On top of that, the big state-owned companies weren't very profitable, and the country was buying a lot more from the world than it was selling. And the final nail in the coffin? Prices for everyday goods were going through the roof, hitting ordinary people really hard.
With its back completely against the wall, India had to turn to the world's emergency lenders, the World Bank and the IMF. They agreed to a massive bailout loan, we're talking $7 billion, but, and this is a huge but, it came with some serious strings attached. India had to agree to fundamentally change how its entire economy was run.
And that ultimatum led to what's known as the New Economic Policy, or NEP. This wasn't just about getting a loan to pay some bills. This was about performing major surgery on the whole system. The goal was to tear down old walls and create a more open, competitive economy where businesses could actually grow and succeed.
The NEP was built on 3 really powerful ideas, famously known as LPG: Liberalization, Privatization, and Globalization. You can think of them as a 3-pronged attack on the old, closed-off system. So let's dive into each one, starting with liberalization.
First up, liberalization. Before 1991, if you wanted to do business in India, you were caught in this crazy web of rules and regulations, often called the license raj. You needed a government permit for basically everything. Liberalization was all about taking a giant pair of scissors and cutting through all of that red tape.
I mean, just look at the difference here. Before, you needed government permission to start a company, grow it, or even shut it down. Whole industries were just off-limits to private businesses. But after 1991, that all changed. Licensing was pretty much gone, the private sector was finally invited to the party, and prices were set by supply and demand, not by some government committee.
And we saw a similar revolution in banking and finance. India's central bank, the RBI, basically shifted its job description. It went from being a strict micromanager to more of a facilitator, a coach. Banks got way more freedom, and for the first time, private and even foreign banks were allowed in, which brought in a flood of new money and competition.
And what about trade? Well, before 91, India was a fortress. There were huge taxes and strict limits on almost anything you tried to import. The reforms tore down those walls. Import licenses were scrapped, limits on quantities were removed, and they even got rid of taxes on exports to encourage Indian companies to sell their stuff to the rest of the world.
All right, so the next 2 pillars, privatization and globalization, were all about changing who owned the businesses and connecting India to the entire planet.
So, privatization basically meant the government was getting out of the business of running businesses. The main way they did this was through something called disinvestment, selling off shares in those big state-owned companies. The hope was that private money and new management could come in and make these often inefficient companies more modern and competitive. You know, like bringing in a whole new coaching staff and owner for a struggling team.
And globalization? Well, that's what tied everything together. The goal was to weave India's economy into the global fabric, to create a kind of borderless world for trade and services. And probably the biggest success story to come out of this
was outsourcing. Because of the IT boom, India's massive pool of skilled English-speaking workers who could do the job for less made it the perfect place for companies around the world to set up their call centers and software development shops.
So here we are, more than 30 years later. What's the final verdict on this massive economic experiment? It was a huge gamble that completely changed the country. Let's take a look at the report card, the wins and the losses.
The numbers here really do tell a story. Just look at that jump in total GDP. Before the reforms, the economy was growing at a decent 5.6%. Afterwards, it just took off, eventually hitting an incredible 8.2% growth rate. I mean, that's a clear sign that the economic engine had been totally supercharged.
But the really interesting part is where that growth came from. The service sector, things like IT and software, absolutely exploded. It became the new engine driving the whole economy. Meanwhile, industrial growth was a bit more up and down, and really critically, the agricultural sector, which employs the most people, actually saw its growth slow down for a long time. So as you can see, the legacy is pretty mixed. On the one hand, you have these undeniable wins, incredible GDP growth, a flood of foreign investment, and India becoming a world leader in things like IT and pharmaceuticals. But on the other hand, critics point out that all this growth didn't create enough jobs, that agriculture was left behind, and that small local businesses got crushed by cheap imports. And there were even accusations that public companies were sold off way too cheaply.
And this quote about a farmer named Mahadeva really puts a human face on those criticisms. Think about it. At the same time the government was cutting back on support like subsidies, which made his costs go up, the market was being flooded with cheap imported oils. He was getting squeezed from both sides, and he couldn't even sell his crops for what it cost him to grow them. It's a tough story that shows the reality for millions of people who felt left behind by this new economy.
Which brings us right to our final question. There's no doubt that the 1991 reforms saved India from a financial disaster and unleashed incredible economic forces. But did that rising tide lift all boats? It created a ton of wealth and opportunity for many, but it also created new inequalities and left a lot of people struggling. It's a complex legacy, and one that India is still grappling with today.
Like, share, subscribe, Civil Scribbles for more.